Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this Atlantic Council event on China's coercion toward Taiwan's diplomatic partners and what the United States and its allies can do in response. We have a terrific panel today to discuss this issue, and we are releasing today from the Atlantic Council a new report titled Beijing Pressures Taiwan's Remaining Diplomatic Partners. Here's what the U.S. should do in response. The report authors are Kish Liao from the Atlantic Council Global China Hub, Nick Foster and Santiago Villa, also from the Atlantic Council Global China Hub. And it draws on some really terrific case studies to get into the weeds on exactly how Beijing targets Taiwan's current diplomatic partners and why that's a concern. But before we get into the discussion with our panel, we'll have some opening remarks from Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy. He's a key Taiwan defender in the U.S. Congress and a leader behind the Taiwan Allies Fund Act. So we really wanted to hear from him on this important issue. He was elected to Congress in 2016 and is now in his fifth term representing Illinois' 8th district. He serves as ranking member of the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, where he's a strong partner for Taiwan, as I mentioned. And he also serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. So before we get to our panel and before I introduce our great panelists, over to Rep. Krishnamurthy for some pre-recorded remarks.
Hi, everybody. I'm Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy. Thank you for that generous introduction, Melanie. I wanted to say it's always a privilege to join the Atlantic Council, and thank you for allowing me to address you virtually. Today we're talking about Taiwan and why it's important for the U.S. to stand by its commitments regarding Taiwan. There are three issues I want to point to: the importance of policy signaling, secondly, the ever-growing coercive pressure that China is applying to Taiwan and its partners, and three, the leadership the U.S. must summon to preserve deterrence. First, at a moment when the administration is toying with offering concessions to Beijing regarding Taiwan, the U.S. must speak firmly and clearly with conviction. The cause of Taiwan is not merely a regional concern. It's a test of whether intimidation can replace international law and whether principle will yield to fear. We see these states most vividly in China's coercion of Japan for its sovereign choice to support stability across the Taiwan Strait. Beijing is, to use the Chinese idiom, sha ji jing ho, killing the chicken to warn the monkey. But let's be clear, Japan is being punished not for misbehavior, but for standing firm. And the CCP's threats extend beyond Asia. Threats against Vice President Xiao in Prague, diplomatic retaliation for Taiwanese diplomats speaking in Germany, and sustained pressure on Taiwan's allies like Guatemala and Paraguay. These actions aim to shrink Taiwan's voice by frightening others into silence. But history teaches us a simple truth: when democracies retreat, authoritarianism advances. That is why America's consistency, our words and our actions matter. The second point I want to make has to do with the security of Taiwan, needing to keep
pace with growing PRC pressure. China's coercion is intensifying across every domain: military, diplomatic, technological, economic. Its air and naval operations increasingly resemble rehearsals for a blockade. At the same time, the CCP seeks to reinterpret international resolutions to erase Taiwan from global institutions. To preserve stability, Taiwan must continue strengthening its self-defense and its resilience. Asymmetric capabilities, as well as hardened infrastructure, diversified supply chains, and a defense industrial base capable of withstanding sustained pressure. And each of Taiwan's global partners has a role to play in doing so, not just the United States. Congress has taken meaningful bipartisan steps through the Taiwan Security Cooperation Initiative and new gray zone planning requirements. But Beijing is accelerating its ambitions. We preserve peace by preparing for conflict, not by pretending it would never, ever come. Taiwan must be prepared not simply to absorb pressure, but to endure it. And we must all help ensure that it can in order, again, to preserve the status quo. U.S. leadership is essential to deterrence, and that's my final point. Deterrence must be anchored by America. First, we must push back against Beijing's misuse of UN Resolution 2758. That resolution never said China owns Taiwan, and it certainly doesn't give Beijing the right to shut 23 million people, namely Taiwan's population, out of the international community. Second, we must deepen US-Taiwan engagement across diplomacy, security, and trade, including through high-standard economic agreements that strengthen shared resilience and bind our economies more closely together. That means expanding, not cutting, the foreign assistance to countries that stand with Taiwan. We deter conflict not by abandoning our principles, but by linking arms with our friends. Third, we must confront the direct strategic link between Ukraine and Taiwan. When aggression is rewarded in Europe, it will be repeated in Asia. Those who surrender Ukraine's freedom will never secure Taiwan's future. The stakes could not be clearer. A failure to deter aggression in one region, namely Europe and Ukraine, undermines deterrence everywhere, including in Asia and in Taiwan. Let me close with this. Taiwan's engagement with the world is not a provocation. It is a contribution. It's a contribution to the world. It strengthens global health, technological innovation, humanitarian response, and the democratic character of the international system. When what threatens stability is not Taiwan's voice, but Beijing's attempt to silence Taiwan. Our task is simple, though not easy. That is to ensure that intimidation never becomes the language of international affairs, and that democracies never stand alone when they chart their own future. If we meet that responsibility with clarity and resolve, the Indo-Pacific can remain peaceful, open, and secure for this generation and the next. And in standing with Taiwan, we reaffirm a simple principle, that democracies should be free to engage the world and determine their own future without fear. I'll just close with another point, which is we know from history that if we don't maintain deterrence, we invite aggression. And where there is aggression, there is conflict. And where there's conflict, there's war. We must not ever go down that path. We must maintain deterrence economically, diplomatically, militarily, technologically, across all domains. And standing with Taiwan, maintaining the status quo until such time that the CCP and Taiwan can negotiate their differences peacefully is the only road ahead. Thank you so much again to the Atlantic Council for allowing me to address you. God bless and take care.
So thank you to the ranking member for those comments. And I really like, in particular, the point that Taiwan's engagement with the global community is a contribution, particularly to some of the developing countries and Taiwan partners who benefit from that. So we have a really fabulous panel here to address this issue of Taiwan's partners and the role they play in deterrence from all angles. We have Johnson Chiang, Deputy Representative of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States, based here in DC. He served in Washington since 2023 in this role. He previously served as the head of TechRo in Chicago, as Director General of the European Affairs Department of Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's also served in Taiwan's Department of North American Affairs in Taiwan MOFA, and a previous tour here in DC where he was Director of the Political Affairs Division as well as other roles. So we're thrilled to have Johnson here with us. We have Samantha Custer, who's widely seen in DC as one of our best experts on aid and the patterns of aid globally, with a particular focus on China. Samantha previously directed Aid Data's Policy Analysis Unit, which blends qualitative and quantitative approaches to answer real-world questions in ways that are both academically rigorous and policy relevant. And I know a lot of folks in DC rely on that data. We have Parsifal De Sola, Parsifal is a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. He's also CEO of the Andreas Bello Foundation, a China Latin America Research Center in Bogota. Parsifal is a Chinese foreign policy analyst specializing in Sino-Latin American relations with a focus on Venezuela. Between 2019 and 2020, he acted as Chinese foreign policy advisor to the Foreign Affairs Minister of the Interim Government of Venezuela. We have Nick Foster, also a non-resident fellow with the Global China Hub. He previously served as Deputy China Advisor for the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. And in that role, he co-led the development of an agency-wide global strategy to compete with and counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. So he's seen the aid side of the coin that Samantha works on from the U.S. government perspective, which will be really interesting. And last but not least, we have Kitch Liao, Associate Director, Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council, where he focuses on Taiwan issues. Before joining the council, Kitch worked in the U.S. Congress in diplomatic postings and as a cyber intelligence analyst for the private sector. And I didn't mention Samantha's new position. She was formerly at Aid Data, now the Catherine M. Kelleher Fellow in Cooperative Security for the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Don't want to get in trouble with UMD for you, and congrats on the new affiliation there. So, Johnson, I'd like to turn to you first to start us off. Can you share from Taiwan's perspective, why is it important that the island maintains its official diplomatic partners? You know, China has been driving this campaign over the past few years to peel them away. And that tells me that that alone is a blinking line that this is something we should be paying attention to. But from Taiwan's perspective, why are those relationships important? And why should we act to support them? Over to you first, Johnson, to get.
Okay. Well, thank you, Melanie, and thank you for your great team, Atlantic Council, for hosting this. I think the Congress may actually answer some parts of your question. I would like to highlight actually some of your points in the report. Well, I saw the report draft earlier by Kitch Liao. By the way, this is great. This is a great report. I would like to highlight some parts of that. For example, I think it's very important to recognize those countries with official diplomatic relations with Taiwan. They have a great contribution to the stability of the Taiwan Strait. I think they have provided their own way to keep the status quo of Taiwan Strait, which is important not only to Taiwan, but also to the US. And look at those 12 official diplomatic countries with Taiwan, most of them in Caribbean, Latin America, and also in the Pacific, primarily South Pacific, and one in Africa, one in Europe. So now I think with the several new policies or new policy initiatives by the Trump administration, new Western Hemisphere is very important to the Trump administration. And look at the national security strategy report released a few days ago. There's a part about the Western Hemisphere, pretty significant. Another part is about Indo-Pacific. I think we have overlapping national interest with the US when it comes to these two particular regions. So I think, get to the point of the report, I want to highlight about this. This is not just a sentimental work to keep this relationship with these countries. This is a matter of strategic importance to Taiwan and to the US. And also, another part is I want to talk about is now we are thinking more innovative ways to keep these relationships going as we encounter challenges from Chinese influence operations in those regions with several tools like Belt and Road initiatives. How do we provide alternatives to those countries? And especially those countries, primarily they are either emerging economies or developing economies. And there's a statistic from World Bank. I think there are about 1.2 billion young people for the next decade will become workforce. However, only 1/3 of them, about 420 million people, young people, will get new jobs. And many of the young people actually from those developing countries. But there is a kind of imbalance issue there in those countries. How do we support them in a much more innovative way compared to China's much more predatory approach to those countries, grabbing resources and actually injecting Chinese companies there, hiring Chinese companies instead of local workers. Yeah, I mean those kind of issues really inspire us to think about how do we work with the like-minded countries, including the U.S., to provide a better approach to support those countries. Yeah, in that regard, we have been working with the U.S. For example, we signed MOU with the DFC, Defense. I'm sorry, Development Finance Cooperation. Yeah, dating back the Biden administration. We hope we can continue according to the MOU together with the U.S. To those regions, and also we work together with the U.S. in South Pacific to build undersea cables. One of the countries we support is Tuvalu with diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And now the program goes very well. And together with the US, with Japan, with New Zealand, with Australia, and Taiwan's a part of that. And this is kind of an innovative and also work together with like-minded countries and also bring in some private sectors into this to make the project more accessible and also in a way commercially viable for more sustainable way to empower people locally there. So that is the way we are doing right now. And I think, as your report mentioned, I think there's a great opportunity for Taiwan and US to work together in this direction. And as we talk with the Trump administration about several new ideas, for example, we think about to build a science park in countries like Paraguay. That's a new thing. Yeah, we try to support an ecosystem there together with not only Taiwan companies, but also with the Paraguayan companies or with the US companies there to empower people there. So this kind of a new tools we're trying to develop. And well, thank you for the report. It mentioned several good points, and I think it opens more opportunities ahead of us.
Great, thank you for that. So, so basically, from Taiwan's perspective, these keeping these partnerships stable and strong plays an important role in maintaining the status quo and keeping Taiwan linked to the international community. And you guys are thinking innovatively about how to make that partnership rewarding on both sides, even more so in the years to come, which is great. Kitch, I'd like to turn to you. You've been doing field work for months on exactly how Beijing is approaching some of these partners. In the China community, we use the word flip. China tries to target the nations that diplomatically recognize Taiwan and get them to flip to diplomatically recognize Beijing. And they've had a lot of successful flips over the past couple of years, which is why we're all paying more attention to this issue than we have before. Can you share a little bit about how long has this campaign been going on, and what are some of the tactics that Beijing employs?
Thank you, Melanie. So for how long has this been going on? Honestly, China has never actually stopped doing this since 1949. when the nationalist government, the KMT administration, actually came to Taiwan. Now, the pace has greatly accelerated since President Tsai got in power, and that's where we are focusing a lot of these efforts on. And the answer is pretty simple, right? China always steps up when they see an administration they don't like, and President Tsai represented everything they hate. This is an independent thinking, from a party that's more friendly to the Taiwanese independence comes into power, and it's basically perceived as a setback, especially comparing to the previous Mon administration. So China used a lot of different tactics, right? What they do with a lot of these Taiwanese allies is first, promises, right? Carrot and sticks. Carrot first. They'll promise all the things you want, from all the tourists you want, all the infrastructure projects you want, all the financial aid you could ever hope for. And keep in mind, like, they don't actually think about what you need. They just offer whatever roughly seem appropriate, roughly seem exciting to you. They don't consider whether you have the capacity to repay these debts. They don't consider whether this infrastructure, fits you, and they might later change it. A lot of countries like St. Lucia later find out they just unilaterally changed their deal after they switched, and without consulting them. Right. This is the carrot part. And the sticks part is also interesting in the sense that a lot of these smaller developing countries, especially in the Pacific, they are very close to each other, right? You have like uncles serving in different governments, different administrations across the South Pacific, across across different island countries. So what they do is they would ask the countries they already flipped to talk to the countries that they haven't flipped. And they understand the power of basically regional engagement. They would ask them to talk about this at regional meetings that's supposed to focus on economic issues, supposed to focus on regional leadership issues, and somehow the issue of Taiwan would come up. Or they'll even try to basically host these regional meetings in China, even though, as the last time I checked, China is neither in Latin America nor in the South Pacific, right? But because they're hosting these, because they are there, they can actually squeeze in people to talk about all of this. And a lot of the representatives from Taiwan's allies that I talked about, this is a universal sentiment. They often I wish we were less alone about this, because if things were to be done on Taiwan in a lot of these forums, because they sway opinions there, then basically, like, these things, there's very little we can do. Essentially, it's literally, there's more people in the room talking about this. There's a stronger rhetoric in the entire event, and that might sway minds. And make no mistake, this is what China is after, right? China, the CCP views information very differently. This is their prelude to war, right? Since 1949, this is what they think about. They need information dominance before they would actually engage in any kinetic conflict. And so this is a very effective way to do this. Thank you.
Can I ask you really specifically, because I know you did these really deep case studies, and just as an example, because it's so odd, can you share the salting of the earth case? Just the highlights of what Chinese representatives.
Definitely. This is another really famous case from St. Lucia. And this is actually one of the reasons we're thinking about proposing this report, because it's so odd and so vindictive, right? So this is regarding basically St. Lucia's stadium. So China initially promised to basically build St. Lucia a 10,000 person stadium. I'm sorry, this is actually not the stadium. I apologize. This is the National Mental Hospital. So they also promised St. Lucia to build a national mental hospital. And over the course of basically 10 years of their engagement, their relationship with China, the hospital slowly progresses. It amazes everybody why it takes 10 years to build a national mental health hospital, but that's how long it takes. But right after St. Lucia in 2007 decided to switch their recognition back to Taiwan, basically China stops that They basically they started transporting all the materials, leftover materials, whatever's useful, like elevator components, cables, windows, whatever they can take to China. And then after that, they salted the earth around the entire hospital so nothing could grow. So that's a very weird and very specific thing to do. So that's one of the interesting things, especially considering they also have people left over still staying on the island in the hope of eventually flipping the country. But I guess they just can't help themselves. Thank you.
But it's an interesting example because I think it exemplifies some of the closed door bullying that happens, right, with these countries.
Yeah.
If you do what China wants, you get a lot of promises, like the mental hospital might not actually be built, but the promises sound great. But if you then exercise your own sovereignty to make your own diplomatic decisions, somebody might be salting the earth around your island, which is pretty extreme. Samantha, over to you. You do phenomenal work just on the details of development aid and the patterns that you see globally. And, many of Taiwan's current and former diplomatic partners weigh their diplomatic relationships from an economic lens. They may stay with Taiwan or, in St. Lucia's example, flip back to Taiwan as a partner because they think that's just going to bring better benefits to them. Others flip to Beijing because they think those economic promises sound better. My sense is it's often just as much, if not more, economics than it is values, particularly with smaller countries. How do you see this from a development landscape? And what does this pattern tell us about what we might be missing in economic needs in some of these smaller countries? Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Melanie, and the Atlantic Council for having me. And it's great to be on a panel with some old familiar faces and some new ones as well. So I think, I'd like to talk a little bit about the economic logic for those de-recognizing Taiwan and a little bit about, well, why is the logic different for those that have not done that? So let's kind of first talk about why countries actually choose to de-recognize Taiwan. So I think there's 4 different reasons for this. 2 of them are more reactive to what a player like China is doing. So the first, and just in fairness here, there's an aspirational logic here. There's a fear of missing out. If you think about China being an economic superpower, its star is rising. Partnering with China could be a boon to their growth economically and in terms of livelihoods. And there's both an economic story here and a strategic narrative dimension to this when you think about countering that. The second reactive strategy, I think, is coercive. And Kitch was talking about this a little bit in terms of the carrots and sticks. So here the logic is that China can promise and deliver aid or investment at a scale that is unmatched by any other player, particularly Taiwan. And countries are locked out from accessing those benefits depending upon their recognition of Taiwan. I'll give you an example of this. Earlier this year, I calculated an estimate of this. By my estimate, China outspent Taiwan 332 to 1 in global development finance to emerging markets between 2015 and 2021. So that includes both debt financing and kind of your more traditional aid. That number shrinks a little bit to 31 to 1 if we look at aid alone, but still it's quite a big difference. And it's also important to acknowledge here that it's not just the direct interactions that countries are having with China that are shaping these perceptions, but there's a powerful demonstration effect as countries watch how China is engaging with their neighbors. And then I should also say that there's kind of 2 more proactive logics here for countries because they have agency too. One is like a transactional approach. So increasingly, we're seeing what I would call a rental market for de-recognition. I can be opportunistic and can change and adjust my policies at any time and bargain with China and Taiwan to get the best deal. And you kind of saw that, Melanie, with your comment about you can flip one direction and you can flip back. So it's dynamic, not static. And then, of course, there is, a subversive aspect to this, too, that China is willing to offer what I would call soft bribes. So junkets or scholarships for your kids for the right elites, but then also some hard bribes. There are kind of anecdotal cases of suitcases of cash being exchanged. And so to kind of round this out, though, we should look at why not all of Taiwan's allies have defected? I think that's actually the more interesting question, because you would assume if this is just about economics alone, if it's just about asymmetry between China's economy and everybody else, then you wouldn't expect to see any countries left standing. But that's not the case. There are these 12 holdout countries that are still recognizing Taiwan. And there's actually even a larger group than that. If you think about kind of what I would call the fence sitters that still have representative economic and cultural offices, they still engage with Taiwan unofficially, short of having an embassy. So for them, the recognition logics may be different. One reason is because of absorption capacity. These tend to be small island developing states or just smaller economies altogether. And so the meaningful difference, there's diminishing marginal returns of what you might get from China versus Taiwan in these cases in terms of what they can absorb. There's also non-material benefits. As much as this is a conversation about economics, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes it's nice to be the big fish in a small pond. And Taiwan's pool of diplomatic allies is small indeed. So it's meaningful that not only in terms of the volume of assistance, but in terms of the feeling of being equal partners is much more prominent in engaging with Taiwan. And then lastly, we should talk about this. I know the report does a little bit. The elephant in the room is the relationship with the United States. So how much, our countries not only thinking about their possibilities of engaging with Taiwan, but also their relationships with the US.
Thank you for that. And that's a good point that I haven't thought about before. But as I reflect on my conversations previously in my government role with nations who are Taiwan partners, because it is a smaller circle, they're getting some pretty special treatment that has a lot of benefits to it. Nick, over to you. You've worked with many of Taiwan's partners, current, former, remaining current partners, some that have flipped just in the past couple of years. When you were at USAID in your former US government role, what do you think that, Samantha mentioned that the US relationship has a role to play here as well. Do you think that US support for Taiwan's partners is adequate? There's always this awkwardness within the US government because the United States, since 1979, has officially ourselves recognized Beijing, but we have the Taiwan Relations Act, which really lays down our ironclad support for Taiwan from a defense perspective, and that we will maintain unofficial relations with Taiwan, including a strong economic partnership. But it is a little bit of a funky needle to thread if we officially recognize Beijing, but support others who officially recognize Taiwan. And I think that funkiness has held the US government back a little bit from having focused policy that might actually be time to do and might be helpful. So just welcome your thoughts. Should we do more? Are we doing enough? How do you see the US role in this, as Samantha mentioned?
Yeah, thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you for this excellent panel. I think this is a really interesting time we're in because the style of foreign policy of the United States is changing as well. So it's not just the substance, but the style. So, previously, maybe things that we considered not possible might be possible now just because we are in this new environment where, the only thing really, maybe the guiding principles is safer, stronger, more prosperous, and that has informed some dialogues. The way we're dealing with allies right now is different than under previous administrations, for example. So it also maybe opens up some new opportunities. So I'm looking at maybe a little bit of a gap analysis of what has happened under this Trump administration in this year, and what could be expecting, what tones are being set. I think we're seeing a few trends. I think we are seeing a lean in on certain parts of the government. So, for example, Deputy Secretary Landau made a trip to Palau earlier this year, and also participated in the U.S. Pacific Island Roundtable and Papua New Guinea. So that's obviously an important sign. Very early in the administration, we saw Secretary Rubio visit Guatemala on a tour of Latin America, and specifically mentioned that he wanted to take the relationship Guatemala has to Taiwan to a new level beyond diplomatic relations to stronger economic ties. We're seeing also some engagement by the US Department of the Interior, as well in Palau, working on telecom resiliency. So there are some good signals coming out of the administration towards select allies of Taiwan, select diplomatic partners. Obviously, as mentioned at the top, Congress is doing some important work here. It's also the US-Taiwan Partnership in the Americas Act that explicitly talks about supporting Latin America and the Caribbean countries in those regions that maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan, deepening that. And even the Congressional Research Service is putting out more products on Taiwan's, kind of raising the awareness on that. So we're seeing some signaling that at least some of Taiwan's partners are not alone, that there is some forward leaning into that space. Congress is creating a little bit of institutionalized deterrence, so that there's some language in these new laws around countering flips. You mentioned flips earlier, Melanie. So developing some mechanisms around that. Now, that being said, I see several gaps. Interestingly enough, I'd start with Latin America. So we saw that quick trip at the beginning of the administration by the secretary. There was an announcement just in January of this year, for example, of an investment by the DFC into Guatemala. But as Johnson mentioned, things with the DFC are kind of in flux right now. So we haven't really seen a signal, not just in terms of the MOU, but also specific transactions. Are they continuing? Are they not? So that's something I think we could see more of. I also say that economic resilience writ large is under-tooled right now compared to the security aspect. Kitch mentioned this in the report. There's an interesting kind of quip from Palau where they see a Patriot missile testing at about 1.5 million each. So a lot of money for a rocket, and that's a lot of money you could use towards economic resilience, commercial ties, etc. And China works in that realm, right? They don't do that much in the security realm. They really focus on commercial capture, tourism, real estate, online systems, licensing, business development, etc. So I think that's an area that we could see more of, and really think of this more from a joint US-Taiwan implementation architecture. So we're seeing these kind of anecdotal engagements, such as in Palau, such as early in the administration in Guatemala, but we're not seeing maybe the promise of connecting these issues and regions so that there is a more unified approach to working with these diplomatic allies as we say in the report, as a potential bulwark against further Chinese incursion into the Western Hemisphere and into the Indo-Pacific, two regions that the NSS calls out explicitly as vital to U.S. national security issues.
Thank you for that, Nick. And for our audience watching online, if you'd like to pose any questions for the panel, you're welcome to send them to askac.org, askac.org. And Percival, over to you. You lead the Andreas Bello Foundation in Colombia, and I know you've been doing a lot of work across all of South America and Latin America, doing research that spans multiple countries. Latin America is a key focus. The Americas is a key focus of this issue, and Honduras was the last country that flipped from Taiwan to China. From your view, how do Latin Americans see China, Taiwan, and the United States strategically? And how does that play into how they make these decisions? And what do you think we should be doing better? Over to you.
Thanks, Melanie. I'm actually going to build on some of Samantha's talking points. There's a reason this panel that we're having today is being hosted by the Atlantic Council, a DC-based think tank. You're not going to see this in Mexico City. You're not going to see it in Bogota. You're not going to see it in Buenos Aires. The reason why, six, half of one of the reasons, one important one, why half of Taiwan's diplomatic allies are in Latin America, particularly, well, five in the Caribbean and Central America and one in South America. The key variable there is the United States. It's because of the relationship between the US and these countries and that overall dynamic that it fluctuates from year to year, but the matter of the fact is that you cannot extract yourself from an analysis on Taiwan's relations in the region cannot be had without considering the United States and the role it plays. By and large, countries, well, several of you have mentioned these. These are all pretty small countries, mostly island states, and truth be told, they do have, and I think especially over the last 2 decades, they've understood that they do have leverage, and I like that Samantha mentioned that these countries do have agency, and even though it's not not complete a complete 100% maneuver that they can pull off, they do. Let's say that they're getting more intelligent in how to wiggle themselves to get actually a benefit. So I think it actually goes on a country by country basis, and the domestic variable of this is very, very important. In some cases, you cannot even rule out ideology. Well, hopefully, elections will play out properly in Honduras once we finally get we already know that's between two candidates that have at least said publicly that they will shift recognition to Taiwan, and this is primarily on one hand ideological, and also because these two candidates seek closer relations with the United States out of domestic interests. So again, I think it's very, very important. Yes, we tend to look a lot at what China does, the way it approaches, be it diplomatically, be it through coercion, be it through sticks and carrots. But I think it's very important to see what these the internal relations, internal domestic context of each of these countries. Paraguay is let's say it's the bigger country worldwide that recognizes Taiwan, and Taiwan is part of the political discourse in the country, and people are very much more informed in Paraguay than what you would find in the Caribbean and in Central America.
That's fantastic. I did not know that in Honduras, the two top presidential candidates were both calling to flip back to Taiwan. Is that what you meant, Parsival?
Yeah, no,
That's fascinating.
Well, at least according to their public remarks, it's like a done
Yeah.
deal once they assume office. One of them assumes office.
Yeah, as in the report we just released, we have some case studies from Honduras and what folks are saying about how things have gone since the flip from Taiwan to China. And it sounds like Honduras's experience is following some of the other nations, which is that the promises sounded really good early on, but the reality was less than desired. Kitch mentioned the mental hospital that took 10 years to build, when we know that that China can do that in 6 months within China, right?
Yeah, no, I think the Honduras case is quite telling, because one of the reasons for talking about shifting back to Taiwan, it's because of certain sectors within the private sector that were very much affected by the switch that came in theory with access to this new 1.3 billion, people market didn't play out. Very angry sectors, and that is why these two campaigns were actually, building on this, well, broken promises and lack of results. So there's a clear connection between, domestic economic issues and a decision to, campaign on switching back to Taiwan.
That's absolutely fascinating. Kitch, you had a point to make.
Thank you, Melanie. Follow up on what Parsifal is talking about. There's actually a lot of these cases, right? Like how countries' domestic politics and what they need actually influence the switch. We kept coming back to St. Lucia because they're the last country that switched back. In their case, it was bananas, right? Like China promised, like for example, they could solve St. Lucia's problem with exporting bananas on the international stage, especially in Europe. And they also something also happened, like to generally the banana population in Saint Lucia when they got sick, and China did nothing on that. So there's a lot of this feeds into this. But I also wanted to address something very obvious, but for everybody here, but may not be for our audience, is why this actually matters for Taiwan's deterrence, right? The reason it matters is because it's very simple. You don't want things to happen when the day comes when China decided finally today, Xi Jinping wake up on the wrong side of the bed, he's gonna send troops to Taiwan. You don't want people at that point start asking, okay, but isn't Taiwan part of China? And then nobody on the international stage, on the UN level, on the official level, could actually come out and says like, well, not exactly, and then start pushing the rhetoric. Then you're pushing again, you're doing an uphill battle while the actual battle is going on. This is already happening right now, right? This is not just on the international stage. Like we can talk about the one China principle, which China constantly confuses with the US one China policy. They do this with every other country on the earth. Every time a country switched, China's MFA put out a statement. It always talks about, we're really glad this country now recognizes the one China principle. But Yan Chan actually did a really good study classifying countries' recognition of one China principle into 10 different categories. Right? Some of them are like the United States. They don't take a position on the issue. They don't want to. And some of them are wholeheartedly agree. But for China, it's all the same. And they want to tell the rest of the world it's all the same, which means Taiwan has no rights to exist in their eyes. So I think that's very important to point out. Thank you.
So that's a good point. So basically what you're saying is it's important for Taiwan to have multiple channels to share its voice with the global community, and these diplomatic partners play a role in that. Let me go next to Samantha and then Johnson and pick up on this DFC point again. I think it's pretty cool that the US DFC and Taiwan's International Cooperation and Development Fund, ICDF, have an MOU to do joint projects together in third countries. Because for the United States, the Trump administration has made very clear the Americas, that's our backyard and that's our priority region. That's where about half of these countries are. And with the Pacific Islands, the United States has been really trying to level up our economic game in the Pacific Islands, and it's really hard to do because it's very far, and these are small island states that have very specific needs. And I think there maybe the US could benefit from partnering with Taiwan to offer some more targeted things that are helpful there. I think Nick raised the case of in Palau, the US military uses Palau as a location to fire and test fire Patriot missiles and make sure that that's working well. But the Palauans are counting them and saying, well, that was $1.5 million. What have you guys actually done for us lately? So we need to level up our game in the Pacific Islands. And we have this MOU between DFC and ICDF. Congress seems to be on track to reauthorize DFC. And what I hear is that they may be nearly tripling its liability cap and giving DFC more flexibility to act in more countries. That's pretty great and pretty exciting. And we have now our Undersecretary for Econ Affairs at the State Department is finally in his seat and confirmed, which means the US and Taiwan can get moving on the Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue and working together to do joint projects. So I wanted to ask Samantha and then Johnson, what should be on the agenda for DFC and ICDF to do together in Latin America and the Pacific Islands to level up both of our nations' kind of economic game, and as Parsifal mentioned, address some of the needs there. So over to Samantha and then Johnson, and if anyone else wants to jump in, we welcome your.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Melanie. And I was fascinated, Johnson. I hadn't realized that the MOU was in place. So that's really exciting to hear. I mean, I think this is an opportunity to tackle two things at once. I said at the top in my remarks that the economic factors that countries are thinking about, it's partly an economic story and it's partly a strategic narrative, right? So I think that having this MOU, it's an opportunity to crowd in additional money to think about pooling of resources between Taiwan and the US in a way that maximizes the resources that you can bring to bear. I think also maximizes the diversity of capabilities that you can bring to bear. It's a powerful story to be able to tell to countries that are participating. I think there's an opportunity here to really be mindful about channeling those funds in areas that most closely match national development priorities of the recipient countries, high priorities for national leaders. That would probably be the greatest sweet spot, I think. Also being mindful of within these countries, like I'm thinking about the domestic politics Parsifal was talking about in Kitch, there are certain industries and interest groups that tend to benefit more in their minds from engaging with China than Taiwan. And so trying to actually look for projects that are going to be able to bolster voices that are pro recognizing Taiwan, mute potential critics' voices, or satiate them. And then I also think, why just limit it to DFC? Think about the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Think about other instruments. It's certainly, as Nick said, the tools are changing for various reasons, but maximizing all of those levers and thinking about that pooling and matching. And then finally, don't forget about the storytelling aspect of this. These are great opportunities to get participating countries to tell their story of not just more money from the US and Taiwan, but better quality development through those relationships. And we are not, in the US context, are not the best messenger for this, but participating countries through sharing their experiences could be.
That's a really good point. Johnson, over to you. Anything you'd recommend we put on the agenda for DFC, ICDF collaboration, or as Samantha mentions, for collaboration between other tools so that we can help each other level up our economic diplomacy?
Yeah, well, thank you for this great question. And I think I'm glad to hear that actually Congress right now is reviewing to reauthorize DFC in a broader area for their functions. I think it's great because there used to be some limitations for their cooperation with countries. There used to be pretty fixed regulation for the countries they want to support. For example, it has to be low income, but in terms of low income, it used to be very poor countries. I think there are only a few countries qualified in the past for their support. But now they're trying to broaden that scope. It's good news. It's good news. And also they're gonna strengthen, broaden the scope of their pool of funding. I think Melanie, you mentioned about the triple. Yeah, I heard it's about $200 billion. It's great. Yeah. And also they're gonna bring in some more private sectors into this conversation. This is innovative. I think most of the countries with official diplomatic relations with Taiwan, I don't think they're asking for handouts. I think they want opportunities. They wanna see more cooperation with Taiwan, with the US, with like-minded countries, as they choose to stand with democracies. I think Samantha mentioned earlier about why those countries still with Taiwan. I mean, you look at the numbers, China with 1.3 billion people, they always talk about, okay, we're a bigger market compared to Taiwan. Why not switch to China? And you heard all the broken promises like Honduras, like some other countries that switched to China and end up with more deficits, trade deficits, like Honduras. Their shrimp export to Taiwan plummeted because of their switch. However, their export to China not approving at all. And Nicaragua trade with Taiwan actually is more than their trade with China. So I mean, that's kind of things, been there. So we have track record about Taiwan story. Taiwan with very limited resources, 23 million people. We import a lot of things. How did Taiwan become a powerhouse of AI high-tech supply chain globally? I mean, we're gonna share these stories with those countries and provide a know-how to those countries. So back to your question about what are we gonna do with DFC in the future? I think we want to do some more modern technologies, for example, like telecommunications. Many of those countries, they don't have good internet service at all. They don't have 4G, they don't have 5G. It has provided several block roads on their way to better economies. Yeah. And infrastructure, very important. Energy, very important. So how do we work together with them to power the economy and to be better utilized their human resources? As I mentioned earlier, only 1/3 of young people could get a job in the next 10 years. And most of them actually coming from developing countries. How do we better utilize with that? Is a very good example. And I want to especially highlight the importance of private sectors into this process. I think it's very important we bring business into this conversation and provide good governance for those countries. As they look at the China model, China is pretty much a state centralized model, state capitalism. So they have all the state-owned enterprises going there. Sometimes they don't make money, they still go there. So we're going to bring up new models for them. And with the track record of Taiwan experience, I think we have great opportunities ahead.
Thank you for that. And Johnson, you're right. When I was at the State Department and would meet with a lot of Latin American nations, they were all looking at Taiwan's unbelievable kind of high-end, high-tech supply chain. And everyone wanted to know, how can I just find a role somewhere, right? Nations that are at lower ends, where their main export is shrimp, for example, and their primary agricultural, they know that they aren't ready to have a fab. They know they're not ready for a processing plant, but they want to know, if you take the supply chain all the way down, where is there somewhere a place for me? And they really wanted to just be in the cool kids club, as I think about it, with the US and Taiwan and other advanced nations. So I know we're just about at time. Nick, I'd like to go to you with this same question of what are some concrete things to put on the agenda for DFC and ICDF. And then Parsifal, if you can close this out, from a Latin America perspective, welcome any final thoughts on how you think, or to the same question, what would be a project that Paraguay, for example, or Guatemala would be most excited about? But Nick, first, over to you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And Johnson and Samantha already mentioned a lot of good things. I want to maybe just put a little bit of a framing on it. The one is, I think that the discussion that we're having today really allows itself to maybe also provide some strategic framing for engagement. So if the DFC really needs to pick this MOU again, it really fits nicely into the new NSS, right? So this engaging in our backyard, engaging in the Western Hemisphere, engaging in the Indo-Pacific makes a lot of sense. Let's use these diplomatic relations. It's a twofer. So I think there's two broad topics here. One is really hard-nosed national security related collaboration. And that, I think the most sense here is really to turn telecom and digital infrastructure into a repeatable offer. We've talked a little bit today about Tuvalu, we've talked about Palau, undersea cables, etc. So building cybersecurity capabilities, telecom governance, etc. So that makes sense for us. It makes sense for the country. It makes sense for Taiwan since it has such a great deep capacity in there. I will say that there's another bucket here. And just briefly, one more thing is, I think we mentioned this in the report as well, seeing if it makes sense to loop countries like Guatemala into the broader ICT supply chain to really benefit from Taiwan's capabilities here. The second bucket, though, is the one that I'm still a little wondering how we can fix this one. And that is when I remember talking to ambassadors from, for example, the Pacific Islands, a lot of the things that they asked for, they saw the value of subsea secure communication, etc. But at the end of the day, what they really needed was a fish processing facility, a little higher seawall, very small things that made a difference in the day-to-day lived experience of their citizens. And that is something that, with my old gig, we used to work on. We used to basically work on the lived experience. So that is something I think is a critical thing to address, because undersea cables, we don't even see, right? A fish processing facility is something that's going to make a real difference in people's lives. And that is something that we also have to talk about. So looking at ways to do economic development that has a national security aspect to it, but also makes a difference in the citizens' lives of these countries, which is going to bind them emotionally also to the United States and Taiwan, because they make a big difference in their lives.
Thank you, Nick. And over to you, Parsiple. The Trump administration just announced this new initiative called Pax Silica. So partnering the United States and other very high-tech economies, Japan, South Korea, to work on the AI supply chain, basically. It's a very high-tech initiative. In your view, how do we bridge that with the Paraguays, the Guatemalas, what Latin America is interested in, what they have to offer? In your view, what does that supply chain partnership look like that the US and Taiwan can support?
Sure. So I think this connects to both Johnson's and Nick's comments. On the one hand, yes, these countries do not want handouts, and they want to be, by and large, seen as equal partners, in areas that do contribute to development. So, and this connects to Samantha's points about stories. That is, it's let's say it has to be a more holistic approach. And to be honest, take one from the PRC playbook. They are very good at promoting when they finance projects, when they finance infrastructure. And again, there's no need to compete with China. That's on a yuan to yuan basis. It's about being targeted, being strategic, and I couldn't think of a better area to be strategic than in the tech sector, where obviously Taiwan has, it's their comparative advantage, and the U.S., given its newfound foreign policy towards the hemisphere, strongly focused on security. You get domestically, you're checking that box. You check the box of U.S. security interests, and you check Taiwan's using their their competitive advantage in tech. Because again, and you know, the messenger is very important. I hadn't thought of it, but you know, getting these countries to bring up these issues, have roundtables when you have regional gatherings where the U.S. is not present. That makes it, you know, it will have a stronger, you know, argument and opening up a conversation that is never present across the region, even if it's only done at the private, you know, in a backdoor kind of private setting. So yeah, I guess that more or less closes it up.
Thank you. And thanks to this really terrific panel. And congratulations to Kitch, Nick Foster, and our colleague Santiago Villa for a fabulous report on Taiwan's partners and how Beijing seeks to peel them away. There's some really great case study detail throughout that's fascinating. So thanks, guys, for this really important work, and have a great afternoon.